Of that 25 million, now many of them are being diagnosed with an autoimmune thyroid disease known as Hashimoto's. Okay? Has everyone heard of Hashimoto's at least? No? Yes? No? No? Okay, yes. All right. So, Hashimoto's is just that. It is an autoimmune disease. And does everyone know what autoimmunity means? Let's start there. Yes? Not everyone. Autoimmunity means that your immune system has created antibodies, which are immune cells, that destroy whatever tissue it's targeting. Okay, so in the case of rheumatoid arthritis, those cells are going to be destroying your joints. So the body, your own body, makes cells that destroy joints in the case of rheumatoid arthritis. Okay, in the case of multiple sclerosis, you have antibodies that are destroying the myelin sheath. That's a protective covering of your nerves. Okay, or in the case of Hashimoto's, it's destroying your thyroid gland. So that's what those immune cells do. They go attack your thyroid gland, break it down, enters the bloodstream, and you have less of a thyroid every time that happens. Now, the most common form of Hashimoto's is you tend to be hypo. So that's why I have these 25 million people. Most of them are hypo, but now you're finding increasing numbers are now being diagnosed with Hashimoto's. And oftentimes what I see is that people who do experience thyroid symptoms after they have been diagnosed with hypothyroidism and still have those symptoms, as I said, they actually have Hashimoto's. Isn't that interesting? You've had that experience. The only way that you can be diagnosed with Hashimoto's is if you have a certain kind of blood test done, and it is not ever done routinely in a typical standard thyroid panel. Okay? So in the standard thyroid panel, definitely the main hormone going to be tested is called TSH. So has everyone had a thyroid panel done in here? You have not, you have not, you don't know. Okay, all right, so TSH, okay, and depending on the laboratory, they have broad ranges. I mean, it's like from 0.08 to 5.0 is probably a very common range, all right? So we'll just say that to that, okay? And if your TSH, which I'll tell you what that is in just a second, falls within this range, then you're fine. Okay, that's another reason why people have thyroid symptoms and they don't understand why, because their doctor told them you don't have a thyroid problem, you're fine, you're within range. Okay, we'll get into that in just a minute, what the range really should be as far as a properly, optimally functioning thyroid. Okay, but going back to TSH, this actually stands for thyroid, whoops, there should be an I right there, stimulating hormone. Okay, that's what TSH means. Now, is that a thyroid hormone? Correct. You're correct. It is not. It's actually, it is a pituitary hormone. So your pituitary gland in the brain, a little bitty gland just above the roof of your mouth, secretes this hormone known as thyroid stimulating hormone, and it does just that. It stimulates the thyroid gland to produce thyroid hormone, otherwise known as thyroxine. Okay? So what happens in the blood test is that if you are over this amount, so if you're a 5.5 or a 6.0 or a 25.0, then your pituitary gland is secreting a huge amount of thyroid stimulating hormone. So what would that mean about thyroid function? It's not functioning. It's not responding to that stimulation. So the pituitary gland is trying to adapt to that situation by stimulating it more. Not happening. Everybody get that? Okay. If it's below this amount, so you can't even find thyroid stimulating hormone, that's really crazy, but let's just say that was the case. What would be happening? Okay, but what's the opposite effect? So pituitary hormone's really trying to stimulate the thyroid over here if it's above 5.0, or if it's not even showing up to this amount, it's hyper. Exactly. The thyroid is just going crazy. And so now the body's trying to adapt by the pituitary gland, not even telling it what to do. It's just running full force constantly. That's hyperthyroidism. Okay? So those are the two different diagnoses you can have as far as that's concerned. That's not autoimmune necessarily. Okay? Now, sometimes if it's really, really bad hyperthyroidism, that is an autoimmune disease, otherwise known as Graves' disease, but we're not talking about that this evening. Okay? Now, that is what is looked at by the typical physician in a typical thyroid panel. There are some other things, free T4, T3, conversion, etc. T7 sometimes, all right? But this is the main thing they look at. And as long as you fall within that range, you're okay. Doesn't matter how you feel. You need an antidepressant because it's obviously in your head. It's not your thyroid. I mean, look, it's within range. Come on now. Crazy woman. All right? Any questions so far? Because it's important you get this before I move on.
That's really interesting what you just said.
Crazy woman part? Oh, okay.
Because I was told many years ago that I will always be on an antidepressant as long as I have a thyroid problem.
Okay.
And some doctors tell you that and others don't.
Mm-hmm.
So that's interesting that you said that. You're the first person I've ever heard
Make the connection?
make the connection.
Okay. All right. So before I get into the Hashimoto's part, let me show you what really this reference range should be in order for you to feel healthy. Are you ready? Okay. So optimal function equals 1.2 to 3.8. Is that a closer range? Quite a bit closer. So that means if you're hitting a 4, or if you want to be technical, even a 3.9, but if you're hitting a 4, you're not going to feel too good. But you're within range. And your typical GP will say you're fine. Okay? Or if you're hitting a 1.0, you're more hyper. Okay? Now, what are some of the symptoms? For example, if your thyroid is running hyperactive, or let's just say overactive. Hyperactive kind of signifies Graves. If it's overactive, what kind of symptoms might you feel?
Well, you can never stop. Your eyes bulge.
You can feel very hot. Okay? In fact, you can have flashes that you're sweating all over the place. Okay? Your eyes would be bulging, not necessarily at a 1.0. That's more of a Graves condition. That can definitely happen. Okay? You can even have a stroke because the body's running the cardiovascular system so hard. Okay? So that would go with palpitations, high pulse rate. Those things can happen for sure. In fact, if you lie down at night, and this is like a consistent thing that occurs, typically in the evening, and you have heart palpitations, so it feels like your heart's racing, that could be at that time your thyroid's going a little overactive. Doesn't mean you have Graves, doesn't mean even necessarily it's an autoimmune disease. It just means that the thyroid gland is running hot, if you will. Okay? The most common thing is that a person will feel very intense inside. So it's like everything's intense. They're kind of wound up. They can't ever calm down. Their mind won't calm down. But physically, they're exhausted. It's called wired but tired. And an overactive thyroid can be driving that. And the thing is you know, people kind of correlate overactive thyroid and losing weight together. And so they think, hey, you know, if I'm a little overweight, but that's the symptoms I'm having, then that's not an overactive thyroid. That is not the case. Okay, it's not the case at all, especially in Hashimoto's. Okay, any questions about that? Now, what are some of the symptoms of a hypo or low functioning thyroid gland?
Very tired, no energy.
Okay, all right. Cold, exactly. Notice the differences. Okay, hyperthyroid, hot, even sweating. Okay, hypothyroid, cold, especially what parts of the body? Exactly. Peripheral circulation. So what does that tell you about the thyroid and what it controls? Exactly. All right. What else? If you have heart palpitations, it means it has control over the cardiovascular system. See that? So really, that one gland is very central to the entire body in many, many systems. So that's why you can feel so lousy when that one gland is not working as it should. Okay, what other symptoms? How about mentally or emotionally? How might you feel? Depressed. Good.
Also anxiety.
Possibly, yeah. That's going to be more of an overactive because of the intensity. What else?
Or you'll cry a lot. You get
Depression?
upset real easy.
Possibly. Yeah, everything seems overwhelming. Yep. On the hyper end, it's going to be irritation. That's how you want to handle everything. Like bite your head off. Okay. Also, brain fog. It's hard to think, hard to concentrate. And so again, at the other end, you can't turn your brain off. It's just constantly working. Doesn't mean it's necessarily hard to concentrate unless it's working so much that you can't get one thought because there's 20,000 at once. But the other end, it's going to affect your thinking. It's going to be very slow, sluggish. Okay. And you can easily gain weight. Unfortunately, when it's overactive, it's not so common to lose it. But it is pretty common to gain it with low function or hypofunctioning thyroid. Okay, so again, this is kind of the standard thyroid disorders, if you will, going on. Not an autoimmune disease. Okay, any questions before I continue?
Can those crossovers, you have some of both symptoms?
Wow, let's just explore that. So now let's talk about Hashimoto's. Okay, probably the most common autoimmune thyroid disease. Now, one of the most common symptoms, standard symptoms a person will have, is all of those symptoms. At one point, they'll have the brain fog, and then later in the day, they can't stop their thinking as they try to go to sleep, usually. They can't turn their brain off. But then, once they do go to sleep 4 hours later, and they've only had 3 hours of sleep, they wake up, and they can't wake up, and they don't feel like getting out of bed, and they're very tired, and etc. Because with Hashimoto's, according to the destruction of the thyroid, you will have both hypo and hyper symptoms, even with thyroid medication. It's terrible. Okay. All right? So that is the issue with Hashimoto's. Now, the only way that it can be diagnosed is if you have a thyroid antibody test run. And it doesn't matter how high the antibodies go or how low they are. If they are over the standard amount, the reference range, you have Hashimoto's, period. The reason I stress that is that some GPs say, oh, well, you know, it shouldn't be over 30 and you're at 35, so you're okay. If it gets a little more, then you probably have Hashimoto's. No, your immune system is creating antibodies against that tissue if it's over 30. You have Hashimoto's. All right, now if you go to a specialist, an endocrinologist, even at 35, he would diagnose Hashimoto's. So just realize there's a difference between what GPs know and what endocrinologists would do. Okay, that's why I'm telling you. If it's 35, you got it. Don't listen to your GP. I never said that. Yeah, if they even will agree to run the tests. Yes, that's another problem. Okay. And here's the other thing, and here's why it's so difficult, is because you can be even within this tighter range, your TSH can be within this tighter range, and if they never run a TPO antibody test, they will never know you have a thyroid issue because it will look like your thyroid's fine. You have to have that test run because you can have very elevated TPO antibodies, okay, and be within this reference range of your TSH. So it can be very difficult to diagnose. Now, if you have those antibodies showing up, then you'll also have to have thyroid medication, even if your TSH is within range. So what you'll run into is that once you start taking thyroid medication, very often you got to really work with your physician because now it's going to go over here and over there until you get the dosing correct. And it can be difficult because the very nature of Hashimoto's is one time it's hypo, another time it's hyper. And so if you're not even out of here, but you have elevated antibodies and you take the thyroid hormone, well, what's it going to do? Likely it could push you over to overactive. Do you see that? All right. Am I confusing everybody? They're like, geez, what is this guy? Okay. No, everybody got it? Yes? Okay. Okay. All right.
Fog.
Yeah.
You'll come to me then.
Yeah. All right. Okay. So then, if you take the thyroid medication, let's say you have Hashimoto's, or even if you don't and you're taking thyroid medication, but you still have the symptoms, what's going on? Why? Well, actually, I already addressed it somewhat in telling you that the thyroid gland controls many other systems of the body. So even if it's off slightly, you're going to feel bad. But even more important to that, I want you to realize something you may not have heard before. And let me tell you by asking you a question. Does thyroid medication improve thyroid function?
I don't think so.
Okay, you don't think so. Anyone else? It's not really a trick question.
Does it just address the symptoms, or is it actually?
It certainly addresses the symptoms.
Addresses the symptoms.
But what we want to know is taking in that thyroid medication, is it actually going to improve or stimulate the function of the thyroid gland?
Well,
It's
see,
supposed to because it's, well, maybe it's synthetic.
Okay. Okay, so another one says yes. You said what? Yes or no?
No.
You said no, she says yes. Oh, we have a debate.
by what you're showing up there, it seems like it wouldn't.
Okay.
Because whatever they give you, with what you were saying, it can go both ways, back and forth, and right?
Mm-hmm.
So
Okay, so taking thyroid medication definitely affects the thyroid gland. It does. But it usually does not improve its function.
Okay.
Okay? Here's the reason. It's like if you own a vehicle, are you going to decide to walk to work instead?
I know.
No, it's silly, right? The body reacts the same way. If it's getting something in, the organ or the gland that would produce it isn't going to produce it. Doesn't need to. So therefore, it doesn't help the function, really. If you want to improve the function of something, that's not the way to do
So
it.
just substitutes.
Exactly.
Okay.
And then, however the thyroid gland reacts to that is what happens. All right? But the thyroid gland, it's never going to improve doing that. There's no reason for it to. You're not addressing why it's doing that in the first place. Okay? Now realize that because of the nature of such as Hashimoto's and autoimmune disease, you may always have to take that thyroid medication. Doesn't matter what you do because there's been destruction to the tissue, to the gland itself. Okay, so I'm not telling you to run out, stop taking your thyroid medication. No, you need it. But obviously other things have to be addressed as well. That's what we're going to be talking about in just a minute. You're still in the days over there? You got it. Okay, good.
No, I got it, and I
Okay.
understand what you're saying, but
Yes.
I'm sitting here thinking, I do want to stop taking it and see what happens.
Oh, I wouldn't suggest
I
it.
don't know that I do that.
No, I would not suggest that at all.
Well, I know. But if it's not helping the gland itself, and it's just masking everything and interfering with other things, it scares you to continue taking it.
Well, it depends on why you're taking the thyroid medication. Now, if you have Hashimoto's, then you'll have to take it.
Well, I don't have that I know of.
Well, have you ever had a TPO antibody test run?
Sorry?
Have you ever had a TPO antibody test run that you're aware of?
Not that I'm aware of.
Okay, then likely you haven't, and so you don't know. And so until you know, I wouldn't even consider it. But even if you don't have an autoimmune thyroid disease, you may still have to take thyroid medication. Because depending on the function of the gland, it may not be possible through other things that we'll be talking about to get it enough at a level that you don't need any. Certainly, getting it to a lower dose is often possible.
So there is
Usually
not,
possible.
there are not supplements to take that can take care of that situation. I'll probably have to stay on.
You mean so that you would never need thyroid medication? Sometimes no. The reason is that supplementation cannot contain any kind of thyroid hormone within the United States. It's illegal. It would actually be classified as a drug or medication. So any kind of nutritional supplement, homeopathic, even herb does not contain any thyroid hormone. It cannot. Okay? So if you have to have the thyroid hormone because your gland just isn't capable, then you've got to take the medication. Now, through nutrition or herbs or homeopathy, you can either tone down the thyroid or stimulate the thyroid, but it doesn't mean it's going to be to the point that you don't need the medication.
Okay, understood.
Okay. In fact, there are certain things you can do that are called adaptogens, which help regardless of which direction the thyroid's going. That's nice, especially with Hashimoto's. Okay. So kind of what I want to focus on a little bit as far as fixing your thyroid gland is Hashimoto's, because it's becoming so common. I said initially with females, but now more and more males are having an issue with it. In fact, the majority, as I stated earlier, the majority of persons who are diagnosed with hypothyroidism actually have Hashimoto's, they're finding. So it's prevalent situation. Okay. Now, so with that in mind, what we kind of want to know is what happens. Why does the body create those antibodies in the first place, those immune cells that attack tissue? And by the way, this is very similar to how any kind of immune system or autoimmune disease functions, what I'm about to show you. Okay? So there's all kinds of immune glands, right? Just pick up your nearest immunology textbook and take 10 years to study it. Highly complicated subject. But there are all kinds of immune cells, but the ones we're going to be talking about are called T helper. Now, interesting, in pregnancy, there's Th1 and Th2, okay? And depending on how a person responds is they will tend to have issues when they're pregnant. Because the body, are all of you aware that when you become pregnant, your immune system is compromised? Immediately, at point of conception. You did not know that. Did anyone else not know that? You did. You did not. You did not. Okay, do you know why? It has to happen. You know why?
So that the body doesn't spontaneously abort the fetus.
Exactly. It's a foreign body. I mean, quite foreign. It's not you, right? It's an individual. And so the body, if the immune system was not compromised, the body would destroy that tissue. Actually, that's one reason why some women are infertile, because their body does destroy the tissue every time it develops. Interesting, isn't it? Okay. So depending on where your inherent weakness is at or your genetics, it just depends on your genetics, you will either be Th1 prone or Th2 prone. Okay? Now, if you're Th1, you're going to be more having allergies and different kinds of things happen as you're pregnant. Does anyone ever experience having increased allergies when they're pregnant? Someone's had, oh, God.
No, I never did.
No? Okay. If it's Th2, they're going to have more infections, like upper respiratory infections, colds, be more prone to that. Bingo.
Yeah.
Isn't that interesting?
Yeah, that is.
Okay? You're going to have one or the other. All right, so there's actually things that you can do as you're pregnant to tone down these T helper cells. Okay? There is Th3. Aren't numbers nice? And that is the modulator to both of these. There's a point to all this. Okay? And nutrition is the main thing that either helps Th3 balance these or detracts from it. Nutrition is the main thing, about 98 to 99%. Seems a little important to me. So, what do a lot of women do when they're pregnant, as far as what they eat, nutrition?
Eat any and everything they want because they think it doesn't matter because they're pregnant.
In fact, oftentimes they're told to eat a lot of carbohydrate-laden foods. Okay? That's the very last thing you want to do, because that will tend to compromise Th3. And so you will have more prevalence towards infections. What did you do when you were pregnant? Don't let your daughter know. Just you and I.
I did eat a lot of carb. I mean, I can remember so clearly.
Yeah.
Yeah, I ate. and
Lots
ate
of
and ate.
stuff. Yeah.
Lots of homemade
It's like the one time
bread and all
that you
good
can eat
stuff.
whatever you want and get away with it because you know you're going to gain weight anyway.
But I also suffered with a lot of infections.
I'm pregnant. Leave me alone. Isn't that fascinating? Yeah. Eating for two. Now, it is true that you do need to increase what you're eating. You are eating for two, but not those things.
Yeah, the right food.
Yes. Okay. So then, there is another T helper cell called TH17 that totally destroys this. Okay? And it's also specifically what starts destroying tissue. It creates this vicious cycle of destruction within the immune system. Okay? And there are two things that turn on TH17 for that destructive cycle. Two things, and only two. Does anyone want to guess what one of them might be?
What, would you go back to nutrition again?
Maybe.
Carbohydrates, diet.
Okay. And stress.
Exactly. Yes, that is correct. All right, diet and stress. Now, what is, and this is important actually, what is the definition of stress to the body? Now, when we think of stress, we think, oh my God, I'm all stressed out, right? Okay, but to the body, what is the definition of stress? Any demand placed upon the body is stress. Any demand. So if you go from an air-conditioned room to 100 degrees outside, is that a demand to the body? That's a change in what? It's not a trick question. Temperature. Okay? You could possibly identify you have thyroid symptoms by what? Change in your temperature. So what does temperature change affect? The thyroid gland. It's what regulates your internal temperature. So if you go to 72 degrees to 102 degrees, your thyroid gland is stressed, which is not any issue if your thyroid gland functions great. It's a big issue if it doesn't. What a thought, huh?
You don't tolerate heat as well.
Not at all. That's why people have more hot flashes in summer. They think it's just because it's hot. No, it's because their hot flashes are induced by the thyroid gland.
So are you really stressing your body out when you go out and exercise? Like jogging or running?
When it's very hot? I mean, if you have a well-functioning body, that's not a problem. I mean, you have to understand. But if you have issues, especially with certain areas of the body, then yes. In fact, doing things like that in a prolonged way could stimulate autoimmune disease. Remember, stress and diet is what turns it on. Okay, now, stress, it also means it's not just acute stress. What does acute stress mean? It's just what's happening right now, and then it's done. Okay? Actually, the body is designed to adapt to that kind of stress extremely well. That's why they call it the fight or flight response. Okay, something happens, you decide what you're going to do, you're all stimulated, and then you do it or don't do it, and you're done. The stress is over. But that's not what happens today. What happens today? How many demands do you have right now? There's always demands to the mind, to the body. Everything is always demanding. That's called prolonged stress. There is no break time. See, during the interval is when the body would recuperate from the stress it was affected by. And so when that happens, you never affect this. But when you have a prolonged stress, then that's stimulated and triggered. So what people often find is that they will, let's say that for a period of time they have to be a caregiver of their parents or whoever, okay? And it can be for a period of years, and then boom, after it's all over with, and it's like, hey, I shouldn't have any problem, that's when they have rheumatoid arthritis or multiple sclerosis or Hashimotos. Isn't that interesting? Because what they did is prolonged stress stimulated TH17 trigger. Okay, so, and if during that time that they're having their stress, they also have a lousy diet, they're going to have a problem. In reality, these two things are the same thing. Because your diet and the prolonged stress affect exactly the same mechanism in exactly the same way. That's why it stimulates TH17. So they're the same thing. Okay? Okay. So that's why when you really want to start lowering the symptoms and the things that you're experiencing, especially with Hashimoto's, you have to look at diet first, because as long as that's one of the easiest things you can change. People think it's the hardest, but it's the easiest because you have complete control over it. Either you can or cannot put it in your mouth, right? This part, a little bit more difficult to control.
Can I say something on
Go ahead.
that?
Yes.
Since I've been coming here and I am following the food program to the T,
Mhm.
my stress, I feel like myself, the stress is like, it's no
Easier to
different.
deal with.
Exactly. It's
Right.
like I don't know, it's like your whole body's different.
course.
Your mind is clear and
Right.
that's
Well, if you
amazing.
think about it, and let's say someone has Hashimoto's, and it's tending towards more of a hyper at that point, then they're already internally feeling overwhelmed. So if they have more stress or they eat something that's not good for them, it just stimulates the entire process more and they feel totally stressed out. Okay? If they have their diet under control, which is at minimum 50% of the issue, right? Then, theoretically speaking, their thyroid can handle 50% more stress. So it's like it doesn't affect you nearly as much.
I totally, totally believe you on all this, because as long as I was on the program, I was off of it for a month before I came back. And during that month, I had so many things go wrong with me physically. And the minute I got back on
She
the
was a
program,
mess.
everything worked itself
She
out.
was.
I mean, I totally believe every word you say because I experienced it.
Well, thank you.
You know, even the family made comments.
Yeah.
I mean, they really did. I mean, it was very
That
obvious.
diet is very important.
It is. It's pivotal. I will say something just to play with your mind, though.
Okay.
Inherent in the word belief is not knowing. You know. Okay? If you believe something, it actually means there's something you don't know. And so you have to stretch by faith to that belief. If you know, then it's a fact to you.
Well, I know, and it is a fact.
Do you see the difference?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. It's actually an important
Never thought about
concept
it that way.
because I don't believe in nutrition. I know. If you don't believe me, well, that's fine. That's because you don't know. Does that make sense?
Yes, sir, it does.
Okay. Yeah. Belief is more like a religion. I'm not saying you don't know, but you think about how many people say they believe, all right? This is not a religion. It is a science because it works this way. It does not work that way. Okay. Just a side point. I thought it was interesting. All right. Any questions so far?
My hot flashes aren't because of thyroid.
There are two. This is a different seminar. But there are two main culprits for hot flashes, all right? And it is either thyroid or adrenal.
Thyroid or what, I'm sorry?
Adrenal.
So if you're waking up in the morning, as you're waking up, you break into a sweat,
Probably thyroid.
but is it hypo or hyper?
Well, that's a very good question. I don't know.
I'm curious about it.
Hmm. Hmm.
And it could be the weather.
Mhm. Mhm. Okay. Yeah, I don't have an answer for that. Well, yeah, we'll discuss that later. Although I will say, talking about waking up in the morning, and referring back to thyroid symptoms, if you wake up in the morning with a headache, and then the headache improves as the day progresses, that's hypothyroid. And it's not like if that happens once. It's like if it's kind of a consistent thing, happens every week or a couple of times a week, that's hypothyroid. All right.
Be a margarita the night before.
Okay, so in diet, let's narrow this down just a little bit. In diet, there are usually two main things that stimulate this autoimmune cell, this T helper cell. Okay, two main things. So you want to guess what those two main things may be? That is definitely one of them. That's one of them. What's the other one? Wheat. That's right. And the wheat family, anything that contains gluten. What grains are in the wheat family, just so that we are clear on that? Wheat, barley, rye, spelt. The safer wheat, as they term it. And there may be others that contain slight amounts, but those are the main offenders. Okay? And they directly stimulate this. That's what it does. Okay, now, the interesting phenomenon with Hashimoto's is that as a person continues with this disease, they usually don't die of it, by the way, just for you to know. It's not a fatal disease, all right? However, as they progress, they start developing diabetes, or they develop dementia, or they develop psoriasis, or something else. And most people would think that that's a separate issue, but it's the same thing. It's just merely a progression of Hashimoto's. What starts happening is that there are other bodies, antibodies called GAD antibodies. And those GAD antibodies can actually morph into a cell that attacks brain tissue, attacks pancreatic tissue, attacks gastrointestinal tissue, or epithelial tissue. And there's others as well. Okay, so depending on how those GAD antibodies develop is the progression of the disease. So if it starts attacking brain tissue, then you'll end up with dementia. If it starts attacking pancreatic tissue, you'll wind up with diabetes, etc. Isn't that interesting? And so that's if you don't control this, by the way. And just taking medication, you don't control this. That's why when you get further TPO antibody tests, you know, one time it's going to be okay, the other time it's going to be really elevated, and then down and up and down and up, because this isn't being controlled. Now, if you get these two in control, then when you get TPO antibody tests, it can be negative for a long period of time. Doesn't mean you don't have Hashimoto's, you still got it. But then if you get under stress, let's say one of your parents dies or some stressful event, boom, triggers Th17, you're going to have more destruction of your tissue at that time until it gets back under control. So it's always a balancing act with it. But you can go long periods of time with no destruction, no symptoms, if you keep those two things in control. Pretty cool, right? Did I give you some power? Okay, any questions before I continue?
How do you fix it?
Don't have stress and never eat. Okay, well, as far as the diet, we really talked about it. If people would eliminate wheat, who have Hashimoto's, and eliminate wheat and eliminate sugar, they would go a long way towards the diet part. Okay? Now, why I say that is that it may not cover it completely, because some people have individual sensitivities to foods that stimulate it as well. What is an allergy or sensitivity to a food, or to anything? Along with our conversation here, what is it? It's an immune response. Okay? So any allergy, regardless if it's food or environmental, it's an immune response, so it stimulates this. All right? But what do you have more consistent than anything else? What you eat. Okay? You don't always suck in the same pollen or the same mold, but you always eat every day, usually 3 times a day. And so,
Supposed to eat 3 times a day.
yes, and so that's what has more of the possibility of stimulating that allergic response. Okay? All right, and usually wheat and sugar are the main offenders. Okay, so you get that under control. Now, as far as stress, remember it's any demand placed upon the body, right? So what are other things that can create that demand? Well, obviously, diet. Remember I said they're two the same thing, all right? But then what about if there's any kind of metals in what we consume? Okay, those metals Okay, those sound like my dog. No, all right, he's in the back. Those metals place a demand on many systems of the body, certainly the immune system, depending on what tissue it's in. Corn syrup, for example, just to tell you what I'm talking about as far as metals. Corn syrup. Do you know that they have very high, and about 90% of corn syrups tested in one study, 90% of them had very high levels of two metals. Just for fun, would you like to guess what two they were? Sorry? Close. Not quite. Close. One of them was mercury. How about the other one? Lead.
Wow.
Mercury and lead. 90% of them contain fairly high levels. Damaging levels anyway. Not necessarily lethal levels. However, if after years and years you're consuming that, do you think it might build up?
I don't see how
Okay.
they can put it on the market that way. That just blows me away. I don't get that part of it.
And almost everything you look at has corn syrup or
Well,
something
yeah.
in it.
You're right. But
It's having the right person on the board that sets the standards.
Yeah.
That's
I mean,
politics.
who cares? You care. Not the person setting the standards. They're not going to eat it. They know what's in it. You don't know. I just told you. You get it? Okay. The people who set the standards, they don't eat this stuff. You do realize that. The scientists who create genetically modified foods, they don't eat that food. You go to Monsanto and the cafeterias, they are not consuming Monsanto GMO food. They know. Anyway, so that's one possibility. What other things? For example, what else is in food besides metals?
Pesticides?
Chemicals. Exactly. Okay. Do you think chemicals have a potential effect on stimulating this? Sure. And pesticides especially, Monsanto again, they are mutagens. What is that? And what do they mutate? That's exactly right. DNA. So they cause genetic expression. They force genetic expression within your body. Okay? Another thing, so we have vitamins and we have minerals, okay? Same thing in soil, right? Especially minerals, okay? And so why do insects attack vegetation? What are they actually after? Duh, food, right? Okay, they're after healthy food, and specifically they're after minerals. And so pesticides, how do you think they might work? Do you think they actually kill the insect? Some of them do, but many of them do not. What they do is they actually chelate, either from the soil or from the vegetation, the minerals that the insects want. Therefore, the insects are not attracted to it, and so they leave the plant alone. However, when we eat it, then we have two problems. One, those minerals are not in the produce, and two, the pesticides are, which the pesticides in that case do what?
Attack your body.
Chelate the minerals from your body. Steal. They're a mugger. Okay? Oh, God, it's a mess, isn't it?
That's why a lot of times organic vegetables aren't as pretty as the other vegetables.
Yes.
And not all organic vegetables are organic vegetables.
And organic vegetables often, that's true. Organic vegetables oftentimes do not last nearly as long. You ever notice that they rot much quicker? Why is that?
No preservatives in them.
True. What rots? Nutrients. Nutrients oxidize. Okay? So if the food's not rotting nearly as quickly, what does it mean about that food?
Lots of preservatives in it.
No, it doesn't have nearly as much nutrition. We're talking about fresh produce.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Okay? Otherwise, you're right. Isn't that interesting? Okay. So that's another thing that can stress the body. Chemicals. Okay, what else? Obviously, emotional stress. Okay? And then there are infections. And oftentimes, you could have a flu that seemed to there's my dog right there. he's hitting the doorknob. You could have a flu that seemed to linger around for three weeks, you know, or a month, and then finally you're over it, all right? And then 6 months later, you have a thyroid problem. Guess what? They are not unrelated. Not unrelated. So you're just not symptomatic of the flu anymore. Now it's stimulated Th17 because of stress, and boom, you have an autoimmune disease. Pretty interesting. So my point to all of this is how do you identify, how do you fix what's going on? Right? How do you find out? Well, you come here. And so here, what we do is use a specific technique. I'm very high tech. See, this is my PowerPoint presentation. There. That's high tech. All right. What we do is use a technique called nutrition response testing. And so what we're trying to do is identify the nutritional deficiency, okay? And we do that through response of the body, specifically with muscle tonicity, which is completely different than muscle strength. You voluntarily control your muscle strength. You can choose to pick up 3 pounds or you can choose to pick up 10 pounds, as long as you have that strength within your body. What you don't voluntarily control is actually the contraction of the cells within the muscle so that you can pick up 5 pounds or 3 pounds or whatever. You don't control that. Your nervous system, your autonomic nervous system controls that. That's what we're testing. Because your autonomic nervous system actually controls the entire body, including your thyroid gland. So it is like the puppet master over the puppets. That's your autonomic nervous system. Okay? So that's the response we're looking for. Is there tonicity to the muscle? Is there not tonicity to the muscle as we are stressing an organ? So we palpate over the heart, for example, which does 2 things. Stimulates nervous system fibers in the second layer of skin, known as dermatomes, and creates ischemic pressure. What is that? Slightly cuts off blood flow. Not to the point of any issue, but enough to stress the organ. So if that minute amount of stress affects the nervous system to the point that now it can't control the tonicity of a muscle we're testing, what does that mean? There's already significant stress within that area of the body, because a minute amount of stress shouldn't affect it. So using that technique, we can identify where there is stress or where there is not stress within the body, which starts giving us clues. Hey, your thyroid has a problem, but I take thyroid medication. My poor dog is whining. All right? So from there, we can begin designing a clinical nutrition program. And what that is, clinical means based upon the symptoms you're having and upon the findings that we have found. All right? And design means according to your body. So you can have 3 people in the room here have Hashimotos. Do you think that what causes the stress or dietary issues within all of them is the same? Of course not. One, it might be wheat. The other one, it might be sugar. One, it could be preservatives. The other one, it might be an infection or some form of emotional stress. You see the difference? But the symptom is the same. So that's why it has to be designed, but according to the symptoms you're having. So that's how we start identifying and fixing what's going on within the body. Questions about that before I continue? No. Okay? Now, what can you do before you have any of that testing done? Don't eat those things. That's at minimum 50% of the problem. That's huge. Okay? The other part, as far as stress, I will tell you that lifestyle stress is probably the biggest significant factor after everything is said and done. Okay, after you clean up all the metals that you can and all the infections that you can and all the chemicals that you can, lifestyle stress is the biggest significant factor. So how do you start dealing with that? Well, there's different therapies that you can do, or you can start doing things like yoga or meditation. Some low endurance exercising can help deal with the hormones that all that stress creates. Deep breathing exercises, those kinds of things to begin trying to deal with the stress that that creates within the body. Okay? So that's how you can start. And notice, at the very beginning I said, how you fix your thyroid, not me. I can just tell you what to do and what's affecting it. It's still up to you to do it. Okay? Again, any questions before I continue? No? Either I'm not covering enough or I've covered so much nobody has any questions. All right, so in natural health, important thing to always keep in mind is that what we're always working with is overall health. Okay? When you go into the emergency room with a broken arm, well, they're not looking at overall health. They're looking at that broken arm. Okay? Which is a great idea, because you don't come to me, I'm not going to set it. All right? Now, the other wonderful thing about overall health is that, for example, we can give you all kinds of different supplementation or nutrition for your thyroid gland, but your body, do you think your body is only going to use those nutrients for your thyroid gland? No. It's going to use it wherever it needs it. And many times we have no idea exactly where the body needs it other than the thyroid gland. But it knows. And so you can start having healing globally within the body that we have never directly worked on. That's kind of a cool thing, because the nutrition is going to go wherever it needs to go. That's what the body does with it. That's what it did to begin with when it formed you in your mother's womb. Right? So that's pretty neat. Now, as I said just a second ago, the flip side of it is that we aren't an emergency care. That's what you need to do as far as your physician and ER and so forth. All right? However, after you break your arm, you can come in, I can test it and see what we can do to help the body heal quicker than it may normally do. That's where we fit in. Okay? So there's time and place for everything that's out there. The other thing that many people wonder and ask about are, as far as the actual supplementation that you use, what do you use and is it safe, is it natural? Well, at the beginning of the presentation, I talked about our philosophy, that we want to help as many people as possible without the use of drugs or surgery. But even further than that, my philosophy is that you should be getting all the nutrition that you need from your food. However, we talked a little bit about pesticides and GMOs. You can understand how that really isn't possible. It just isn't possible anymore. To further add to that, there's a fairly high amount of calcium. In fact, just as much in a glass of milk as in spinach. So calcium, same amount in 8 ounces of milk, cup of spinach. However, that stat was true in 1950. Okay? Today, and the common spinach today, you would have to consume, how many do you think, just for fun? 10 cups? 15 cups? 3 cups? What do you think? Somebody just throw a number out there.
25.
25? That's a, 25 is a lot. Okay, 1950, 1 cup of spinach and 1 cup of milk contain the same amount of calcium. Okay? Today, 1 cup of spinach, how much do you think you would have to have in order for it to contain the same amount of calcium as in a glass of milk?
10.
Okay, 10, 25? I don't think I'm going to be eating 10 or 25 cups of spinach. It's actually 80.
Whoa.
Because our spinach is.
Just think about that for, yes.
Organic also?
Yes, not much difference. There is some. Even if it cut it down 50%, which it may close, I think it's like 40% difference.
Why the difference today than 19?
Because it is not in the soil.
It's what?
It's no longer in the soil. Remember what the pesticides do?
Yeah, I understand that, but if you're eating organic,
Okay, how long has the soil been organic?
true.
All right, it only has to be 7 years that synthetic pesticides were not used. It's not long enough for that amount of nutrition to be back in the soil. So pretty much, if the soil hasn't always been organic, you are not ever going to get the levels of nutrition you need, even in organic food. Yeah, I know I'm really discouraging you, but however, what do you accomplish? What do you accomplish eating organic food? One of the things that creates this problem, what did we talk about? Less synthetic chemicals. Okay, so less stress in that way. You will accomplish that with organic food. So that's good, well worth it. All right. Any other questions? No. So going along with that, the supplementation that we use, that's what it is. It is whole food, and it's really concentrated whole food. Now, going with your question and what I said about it, one of the main supplement companies we use is called Standard Process. They've been around for a very long time, since 1929. And the main reason that I use that is because the farmland, it's in Wisconsin, Milwaukee, Wisconsin. They have been farming that land organically since 1929. That's a long time, okay? And so they measure every year or maybe every 3 years the thickness of the topsoil, because that gives you an indication of how much nutrition is in there. If you remember the Dust Bowl in the 20s, you heard about that, right? I lived there. You know, that's how well nutrition works for me. Finally, somebody got it. Okay. Come on, that was funny. All right. One of the reasons that the topsoil was blowing is because it was very thin due to the over farming of it. Okay, it was only 2 or 3 inches thick. Today, the average farmland, commercial farmland, is 4 inches. I guess that's a little better. Enough for it not to blow away anyway. The Standard Process, their farmland, they have 1,000 acres. It's a minimum of 36 inches. Significantly different. Okay, so you are getting, who knows if it's the amount that you should be getting, but certainly it's more than average, the amount of nutrition within those concentrated supplements. Okay, so that's why oftentimes I tell patients that the supplements they take is a food vehicle. It's just a way of getting enough food into your body, because you cannot possibly eat 80 cups of spinach. It's just not going to happen. And that's just for calcium. Okay, so you use supplementation in a concentrated form to get the amount of nutrients your body is needing. Just as a fun factoid, because I seem to be full of them this evening, the RDA, Recommended Daily Allowance of Nutrients, how did that develop? The way it developed was the least amount of nutrients that you had to have so that you did not get a deficiency disease. Any less of vitamin C, you'd acquire scurvy, as an example. Any less of vitamin B, you'd have pellagra, which is very similar to schizophrenia. Seriously, okay? So, let me ask you, just enough to not have schizophrenia or pellagra, do you think that's optimal health? Of course not. That's silly. RDA means nothing. It's not optimal levels. Okay? If you only eat your recommended levels, you're just barely there. You're not blowing away in the wind. All right. So any questions about our topic this evening? No? Okay.
I have one.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so, when would you recommend that you would get the test to see that if you fall in the category of?
Hashimoto's?
Yeah.
I would say anytime. If you suspect, then ask your physician.
And then once you get that, you will always have it?
Yes. If it's positive, you always have it, even if in subsequent testing it's negative.
Because of what it's already because of the damage that's already done.
Yes, and the immune cell will always be there if these two things become too much of a problem. It will trigger the TH17.
So once TH17 is triggered, you have it?
Say that again, please.
Once the
TH17, in this
is
case, you will have it, yes.
You will have it.
Yes. So you can control that immune cell by controlling these two things. But if you do not control these two things, then you will fire up this immune cell and you will lose thyroid tissue. Do you understand? So you could go for, if you did everything perfectly, which we're dynamic and our environment and the world is dynamic, so that's really not possible. But if you did everything perfectly, you perfectly controlled your stress, you perfectly controlled your diet, and you had positive Hashimoto's, you could go until the end of your life and not have TH17 fire again. It's not possible, but theoretically it could happen. Do you understand what I'm saying? Okay. But if you, just a slight margin, didn't control it, boom, there it is.
So if I went to the doctor and says I have it, and then you would recommend
He would recommend probably Synthroid.
So, would you be able to control it without taking what he says?
No.
You would always have to take.
Yes. But you also have to do more than that, because just taking Synthroid, you're likely to still have lots and lots of symptoms and feel terrible.
So what does what does that do, the Synthroid?
It keeps your TSH where it should be, so you don't become extremely hypo or extremely hyper. No. There's supplements that will help controlling all of this, okay? But once you need the medication and that actual thyroid hormone, that's what you need.
Okay, but there's Synthroid and others that are synthetic
Correct.
thyroxine.
Yes.
And then there's Armor.
Armor thyroid.
To the best of my knowledge, that's the only one that's
Natural.
yes.
Yeah.
It's
Pig.
producing- yeah.
Yeah.
Do you? This is a sticky question, but bottom line is, do you recommend one over the other, or would you test to see what the individual's body uses better?
That would be exactly correct. You would test, because everybody will be different. Some people will do just fine with the Armor. Others absolutely will not. They have to have the synthetic. Okay? And it really does depend. So many natural health clinicians will tell you it should be Armor because it's natural, which that's great, but it just depends on the person's biochemistry. Okay? So don't think synthetic in this case is, bad. It's not necessarily bad,
So when
which is why they get fat and no longer want sex or want sex too much. That's kind of wild, right? Okay? Now, the other problem with it is that what you're doing, especially in like a reuptake inhibitor, which is what you're talking about, is that you are inhibiting or stopping the body's ability to get rid of the used hormone, neurotransmitter, serotonin. Okay? So your body will produce it, but not get rid of it. So you continuously get higher levels because the body can't get rid of it. Well, you only need a certain amount, right? That's why the body produces it, gets rid of it, produces it, gets rid of it, because it has to maintain a proper level. So if it can't get rid of it, the body will adapt in some way to that exceedingly high level of hormone. And the way it will do it is two ways. One, it will start producing less, which doesn't sound like a good idea. Or two, which is the most common way it adapts, is it will make the very cells themselves less sensitive to the hormone. Okay, so if the cells are not as stimulated by the hormone, then obviously it can tolerate much higher levels. Okay? The problem is that actually makes the situation that the person took it in the first place worse.
That's why they always having to tweak your medication.
And it's almost always higher levels, switch to another one. Higher levels, switch to another one. That's what happens. And so as far as the thyroid, for example, there could be an issue with hyperthyroidism due to a GABA issue. GABA is a neurotransmitter that's inhibitory, naturally inhibitory, or suppressing to the body. It can suppress thyroid function. And so if you have low levels for whatever reason of GABA, and there's actually specific reasons that most commonly occurs, then your thyroid can't be controlled. So now it just becomes more and more active. Okay? And remember, you take an SSRI that affects all of them. It affects dopamine, norepinephrine, GABA, all of them. Does that make sense? Okay, and with that, serotonin specifically affects estrogen. Dopamine specifically affects progesterone. Acetylcholine specifically affects testosterone. And vice versa. Not to make it complicated or anything.
you're way over my head.
I asked that question also because you had mentioned the antidepressant earlier. And what the doctor told you or didn't tell you.
Yeah.
It's just so automatic.
That's a fascinating subject, though, isn't it? Especially when you start understanding that serotonin, as much serotonin in the brain as in the small intestine. Okay? Exactly the same amount, if not more, actually, in the small intestine. And so then you start saying, diet. And you realize why, if you eat wheat or sugar and you have an allergy to it, what will happen first is your small intestine becomes inflamed. Now, why do you think there's as much serotonin in the small intestine as in the brain? because the two have a direct connection. It's like a bridge. Car's going right over. So you have inflammation in the small intestine, you immediately inflame your brain. The brain will immediately respond to it. Could be headache, could be brain fog, could just be mental fatigue. And what's actually happening is the response is you're destroying your neurons, which are brain cells. That's the response. You don't regenerate more neurons. Interesting, huh? Okay.
What is there to replace instead of the wheat? When did wheat become so bad?
Many years ago. It's been a progression of things. For one thing, people have been overeating it now for many decades. So now they have an epigenetic effect. I'm just throwing in all kinds of big words. Epigenetic effect is when the environment within the cell changes your DNA. Your body is not designed to have the same thing over and over and over and over and over. Okay? So once you do that, it sensitizes itself. Once it sensitizes itself, eventually it will affect the genome itself. Okay? That's the first reason. The second reason is that the wheat itself, for the most part, is genetically altered. In fact, if you look at wheat farm land, you know, it used to be that wheat were at least 4 feet high. Did you know that? Blow, you know, grains. How's the song go? Amber waves of grain. There you go. Well, you look now, it's about this high. I don't think it's going to be waving amber waves of grain. Why the difference? Because that's one thing. It grows faster. Number one, it's been genetically modified. It is no longer a food. You have to understand it's now synthetic once it's been modified. It's fake. The reason is that they could have a tenfold production of the wheat within the same farmland than if it was 4 feet tall, because it would fall over. So you could only have a certain amount. If it's only 18 inches high, a whole lot more. You get it? Okay.
You know, hearing you say that, and I do remember that back in 44 or 46, my uncle had wheat farms, and I remember how tall even then the wheat was.
Exactly.
I never really thought about it until you just said
Exactly. Thank you for saying that, because many people don't even realize it. They're not old enough to know it. And that's a disadvantage of people not being on farmland anymore, not even knowing where their food is. And, you know, now their subsequent generations have no idea. They don't even know what food used to look like, let alone where it came from. Isn't that interesting?
Yeah, it is.
So it is not even food anymore. Genetic modification is bad stuff, like corn. In the 70s, corn is the most genetically modified grain or vegetable, if you will, out there. Okay? You have to assume now that even organic corn is genetically modified. Does not matter if it's organic or not. Now, why the genetic modification in corn? Well, there is some newer corn that's genetically modified with Agent Orange. Did you know that? As a pesticide. At least a molecule very similar to Agent Orange. However, the original modification was in the 70s, and it was funded by the United Nations. And what they're trying to do is get rid of a population issue within Africa. And so what they did is they began splicing the genes of corn with female ovarian antibodies that attack sperm. Okay, so this is what now the corn seed had. So people who would eat the products or the corn itself, guess what would happen? They could not conceive.
That's cruel.
That's criminal.
There's too many people in Africa. Come on now.
Well, I realize that, but there's a better way. I mean,
For who?
oh.
Exactly. So there you go.
They had to teach them how to grow corn first.
Yeah, and I will tell you, you know, the women, you know, young women that I work with who are infernal, many of them, I'd say 40% of them anyway, they will test on corn allergy in their ovaries. Isn't that interesting? I always wondered why that was, because it was pretty common, you know, 40% is pretty common, and then I understood once I learned that. It's like, wow, that's really interesting. Here's another interesting factoid as far as fertility cases. Brown rice often tests as affecting the uterus. For whatever reason, I don't know that one yet, but I'm sure one day I will learn why.
Wow.
Mm-hmm.
There was a point in my younger years when after I was married, had kids, in my younger years, brown rice was the only thing I would eat. I wouldn't touch white rice.
Well, it's healthier.
But I had numerous infections.
You mean like reproductive infections? Interesting. Well, there you go.
So that blows my mind.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, at this point, I don't know the connection, but I know there is one.
Wow.
Okay. Any other questions?
I have one.
Yes,
Is
ma'am.
Iodine or Iodorol?
Iodoral. Iodide.
How does that?
Iodine and iodide.
Yes.
Yes, iodoral is a brand of that. How does it affect? Sometimes that can actually be why a person has a thyroid issue. You have to have that trace mineral. You get the idea and importance of minerals now? You have to have that trace mineral in order for your thyroid gland to produce thyroxine. The same thing with another mineral, otherwise known as selenium. You have to have selenium and iodine. And they're all trace minerals, and they're not in the soil. I will absolutely guarantee it. They should be, but they're not. They also should be in salt, but they're not, unless you're eating Redmond's real salt or Celtic sea salt. Anyway, and that is what it does. However, if a person has Hashimoto's, they should not consume iodine because it will stimulate that. Okay? Now, it doesn't mean if it's a teeny tiny, under 180 micrograms, that's not going to make a difference. But if they start taking like iodoral, 12.5 milligrams of it, they are going to fire up those autoimmune bodies a lot. So just as you go out there, if you ever have other natural health clinicians work with you, if they want to give you iodine and they do not know if you have thyroid antibodies or not, then if it was me, I would not take it unless you absolutely know.
Will it test whether you need it or not?
Sure. You see, if the body's deficient in it, it needs it. And so it will test. Interesting point, huh? Remember, what we're doing is we're looking for nutritional deficiency. Okay. Doesn't mean you don't need it. It just means that it will stimulate it. Any other questions?
So no corn is good, right?
I don't think so.
No wheat.
Yeah, I just made everybody feel great, I can tell. I don't know, Deanne's over here. She's like, hey, I'm doing pretty good because I'm just following everything, and now it all makes sense, so I'm just going to keep on doing it. Before, I was just doing it because you said so, and I felt better, but now I understand.
You have targeted so many things about her tonight that were her problems, and now that she's off of it, there's been a change. I mean, you have really hit the nail on the head on several things with her tonight.
Yeah.
I'm totally off wheat and sugar. And I feel, oh my God. Week before last week, I came into my appointment, and I love my beer. I like my beer. So in the evening, I have a few beers, sometimes a little more than a few beers. But it was always Michelob Ultra because it's like it has lesser calories. Well, I was following to the T. And when he tested me, it's like, okay, your gut is not right. What is this? And it was funny because took a couple minutes. It was like, the beer. So I was a little
Which also shows the importance of what? Food records.
Yes, yes. So he told me about a beer that doesn't have wheat. And today, and I have not had to take a Gaviscon. And I used to eat those things like candy.
And let everybody know what that is because they may not know. What's a Gaviscon?
It's a lot better than Tums. It's an antacid. If you have an upset stomach or you have reflux, you can take 2 of them, and within seconds, it's gone. I know it's not good for you, but
You
Right.
still have your beers?
yes, ma'am.
But what kind?
One? What one?
The beers, actually, Labron told me Red Bridge.
You know, I should start a brewery.
Yes, you should.
Huh.
Yes, you should.
Huh.
While you're at it, make some wine too.
What make some wine too?
No, but Red Bridge, and it even says on the bottle,
Gluten-free.
gluten-free, naturally gluten-free.
Right.
And it is made without wheat and barley. And I actually found another one. I'm going to bring it
I would like to see that.
to him, but
Right.
it's a hardcore. I think it's called hardcore apple cider, and it's gluten-free.
Yeah.
It is freaking awesome.
Yeah.
If
Now
you
that
like
is-
apples,
That is
it's-
not a beer. Apple cider is not a beer.
But
It is apple cider. It tastes like beer, but it's apple
well, I mean,
cider.
it has alcohol in it.
Of course, that's why it's a hard cider.
It's not beer.
But then
No.
that's sugar.
There's sugar in it.
Well, see, that's why I need to bring him the bottle because it
Well,
has
no,
the
no, that's
ingredients
not
on
what
it.
she means. That's not what
Oh.
she means.
Oh,
There can be sugar added, but there's always sugar. It's alcohol.
The fermentation creates the
Mhm.
sugar.
but that's natural.
Don't worry.
Okay. Good.
You're doing fine. You're responding. You're all right. Okay, so, well, we'd have to test it as the very best way. So you go to Specs, you buy different kinds of alcohol, bring it in, huge ice chest, and we'll have a few and figure it out. All right.
All right.
Like it's the Mont
So-
Lily organic
Actually-
vodka.
My sister-in-law, I was telling her about this beer because they do the same thing. They get home from the field and they pop open a beer and relax, right?
She's talking about Dawn.
Ah,
Oh yeah. And I was on the phone with her and I was telling her about what Laban had told me about the beer, and she goes, "You know, forever, for as long as I can remember, in the late evenings, my allergies, like I can't breathe." And I said, "You know what, Dawn? She always does that. It's just normal, natural for her." And she said, "Maybe it's the weed. You know what I'm gonna do? I'm gonna go find that beer. Where'd you get that from? And I'm gonna try it." She said she did, and
no problem.
I mean, it's just crazy.
That's
I
fantastic.
mean, it is. It's wild.
Mhm.
Anyway, I'm happy. I can still drink my beer.
So-
Non-alcoholic beer, is that wheat-free?
I don't know.
Probably not.
Don't know. So as far as new patients, the next step is actually an initial consultation. And at an initial consultation, the idea of what we're trying to do is find out if a health improvement program, nutrition response testing is going to help you or not. Because if it is, then that's the best thing you can do. But if it isn't, you don't want to waste the money on it and so forth and so on. So there's different kinds of testing involved in initial consultation. We do what is called bioelectrical impedance, which finds out how much body fat you have and how much lean muscle mass and how much fluid you have. And then we do a heart rate variability, which actually tests, remember that puppet master I talked about, as far as controlling the body, the autonomic nervous system? It's a computerized test of that system. Is that system actually functioning correctly or not? Because if we're trying to gather information from the autonomic nervous system and it isn't up to par in its function, then the information we gathered is not accurate and we could not help you. So that's the first step there. And then after we do that, we do a nutrition response testing examination, and that is what helps us find out right now what the body needs in order to start getting a better level of health. Now, typically, a nutrition response initial consultation is $147. If you referred to us through one of our patients, then it's $52. Reason being is that, just like you're sitting here, our patients educate their friends and family well, if they're willing to listen. That's the key thing, yeah. And so it doesn't require as much work and education on our part. However, at presentations, a person sat there and they understand, they get a better idea of the entire system, then we offer a completely free initial consultation. What they have to do is schedule that initial consultation this evening to be seen within how many days, do you know?
I think it wasn't it within the next 2 weeks.
I actually forgot to ask Tanya. A couple of weeks, 14 days anyway, okay? So you schedule this evening to be seen next 2 weeks. And if you want to take advantage of that offer, what you do, right here, public education workshop screening form, you fill this out, you give it to Robin, and she will schedule that initial consultation at no charge. There. I'm done. Any questions? No? Yes. Well, whatever your physician